Hello there, and welcome to the 12th episode of the Kurosawacast. I'm Rob Beams, and I'm joined as ever by Craig Ennis. Hello, Craig.
Hello.
Hello, and this week we are talking about Throne of Blood, Kurosawa's 1957 William Shakespeare adaptation of Macbeth. We don't necessarily even really need to recap what the story's about here, do we? I think most people probably know Macbeth, although I think you're somewhat of maybe tell me if I'm overselling this, but you're something of a Macbeth expert. You're something of a you're something of a Macbeth kind of aficionado, right? So maybe you can explain that broad strokes, what okay. Macbeth is.
Macbeth is sort of a relatively it's one of Shakespeare's tragedies. The title character is loose. It's based on some historical figures, although the story is entirely made up, I believe. So there was a King Macbeth and a King Malcolm and a Fleance, I believe, once upon a time. But all the actual ins and outs of the stories are just out of Shakespeare's imagination. So Macbeth is kind of like he's a high-ranking kind of loyal thane of Scotland, and thanks to his kind of bravery in battle, is promoted by which king is it? Not Duncan. Is it Duncan or Malcolm?
King.
A king. I can remember. I always get Duncan and Malcolm confused. This kind of promotion is kind of foretold by three witches who tell him that he's going to be king, but his descendants won't be, and his best mate Banquo, his son, will be king one day. And there's other ins and outs to this prophecy that start to come true. So after sort of telling this to his wife kind of encourages him to go down the path of killing the king and taking the throne. And then the paranoia about the rest of the prophecy kicks in, about Banquo's children and whatnot, and it starts a little kind of rapid descent into more violence and madness, and ultimately doesn't end well.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we can spoil Macbeth. Macbeth dies at the end, and in the Shakespeare plays, I remember doing it at school and being sort of taught about the ending supposedly being about how Macbeth manages to kind of have a heroic death in the end, because he manages to he kind of pulls himself together and goes, okay, well, I'm going to go out. I know I'm going to die. I know I've failed, but I'm going to go out now as a warrior and in some kind of blaze of glory. Doesn't really get that in the Kurosawa version, does he? This Macbeth is a lot more, I'd say, Donald Rich in his book describes this Macbeth as cowardly in places. This is a much more kind of obsequious, kind of weaselly Macbeth than you're used to seeing. Even his sort of, you hear about his great victories at the beginning, but very quickly after that, it becomes clear this is not like a man who's supposed to be like super noble, who strays. It seems like a guy who's a bit of a twat, who's encouraged. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, we'll talk more about his lack of bravery in the end scene later, I guess. But from my understanding, I'm not sure that's acting. In the end scene,
the fear, yeah. So basically, Throne of Blood, just to give some context to it before we start off.
Is it right? Am I right in thinking there is no particular time given? It's kind of like a nebulous time in Japanese history. There's no specificity to it.
I think it's sort of completely ahistorical. It's just set in like a period setting in Japan. Although Kurosawa paid a lot more attention than a lot of his contemporaries to trying to make jidaigeki period films, trying to make them a lot more gritty and visceral and realistic than a lot of his contemporaries, who made much more like not quite like the kind of what are they called, the Chinese sword fighting films where people fly around? They're wuxia, right? Wuxia. Not quite like that, but there's an element that they almost lean more towards that than towards Seven Samurai. A lot of these Japanese period films of the period, because people do, they'll fight 1,000 men in a sword fight and they'll win, and that kind of thing. And they're all very kind of broad strokes, very heroic, all these kind of tales of legends, and all kind of increasingly at this point as well, as color comes in, these very brightly colored, very very clean, very kind of inert historical pieces that exist in Japanese cinema at the time, that Kurosawa and some of his contemporaries in the 50s are sort of going against. And so while this isn't set in directly any particular kind of Japanese moment or based on any real figures, there is an attention to detail and a grittiness and everything to it, which I think would elevate it among some of the things that supposedly are historical from the same time that I've seen. But what I'll say, to give this just a slight bit of context, is that Kurosawa has been, for the last decade, kind of solidly making a reputation for himself in Japan. A lot of his reputation kind of in Japan got buoyed by Rashomon winning the Golden Lion. And so the studio started thinking, oh, good, we've got this thing here that people care about outside of Japan, and it's kind of been validated by the outside world, so we like it now. But there wasn't like... he's not been making the blockbusters all this time. He's not been making the top films of the year in Japan. And I was able to find, very kindly, somebody on Reddit helped me find an English language version of Japanese box office by year in the 50s, and like what the top grossing films were each year. Kurosawa really doesn't feature until Seven Samurai, which I think was the highest grossing film of that year, and then Throne of Blood, which was the second highest grossing film of 57 in Japan. And I kind of find that interesting, because there are other films he's made prior to this. Obviously, we'll get to your opinion on it. I don't really know what your view is on Throne of Blood yet. I would say there are other films he's made in the 50s prior to this that are maybe more traditionally crowd pleasers than Throne of Blood is in places. Throne of Blood, for me at least, there are bits where it's quite slow and it's quite stagey, it's quite theatrical, and so it's I find it strange, not bad strange, but just kind of interesting, like why this one is like one of his few box office like hits, because Kurosawa, like I say, like most of his films are successful in Japan, but they're not massive blockbuster hits. And Seven Samurai and Throne of Blood in the 50s, those are Kurosawa's two hits. They're his biggest films. So that's part of the
it is a tried and tested story. I mean, it's lasted.
There's something to be said for that, because a lot of the, as I sort of implied before, a lot of the Japanese box office hits of the time are these retellings of well-known Japanese stories. It's quite Japanese cinema is quite, I don't know if formulaic's the right word, but probably is in the 50s, is that you'll see like Mizoguchi making the story of I think the 47 Ronin, I think it's called. And then you'll see another one of his contemporaries make that a couple of years later. And then somebody else makes it a couple of years later. There's these standard stories in Japanese kind of history and folklore that just get made and made and made again and again and again every couple of years. And so maybe you're right there, is that the familiarity with this text and that it is a well-known story possibly counts for it.
Yeah, I mean, that's... I don't know. I don't know how much cultural cachet Shakespeare has in Japan, but I'm assuming we're kind of taught in English schools to believe that it's renowned worldwide in every corner of the globe, aren't we? But I don't know how accurate that is, but.
Yeah, exactly. Well, me neither, but it's interesting. There was another thing I wanted to mention before we kind of kick off, was that apparently Kurosawa wanted to make this Macbeth film from before he made Rashomon, and he was actually in a kind of pre-production phase with it. He was writing an idea of doing a Macbeth film, and the reason he didn't make it at that point and it got postponed was because he heard about the Orson Welles version, which was made in 1948, and that's really interesting because, for one thing, like I say, the Japanese film industry doesn't care about repetition. Same films get made every couple of years. So there being an American Macbeth wouldn't bother anyone in the Japanese film industry particularly. And also, the world isn't quite globalized yet in the same way, where Orson Welles' Macbeth is going to come and like steal the Japanese box office or whatever particularly. So what that speaks to me is how plugged into quote unquote world cinema Kurosawa is. Like he wants to do unique things. He wants to push boundaries. He wants to be telling these stories fresh and from his own point of view. And so when he hears that Orson Welles is doing it, it doesn't really matter that that's probably something that wouldn't bother really anybody else in Japan at the time. It bothers Kurosawa, and he doesn't do it. And I think that's kind of interesting to where how plugged in he is to what's going on elsewhere. So yeah, that's the only sort of beginning context I'll give to it. There's one other thing actually, which is that he originally wasn't intending on directing it. He wrote it and he wanted another director to make it. He wanted to give it to a young director because during most of his career at Toho in the 40s and 50s, he was also writing a lot of films that other people made, and this was intended to be one of those. But Toho looked at the budget for it and they said there's absolutely no way we're giving this to like a young untested director. So they said Kurosawa should make it himself, and so there we go. So this isn't even a film that he intended to make.
Too many horses.
Yeah.
Too many horses and flags. Nice flags.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we get here. So basically, straight off the bat, the main obvious kind of banner change to Shakespeare's Macbeth is that we're no longer in Scotland. We're in a kind of feudal Japan, and all the names have obviously been changed. So it's not Macbeth. It's what's his name, Greg? Urshizu. He's general, right? Is he like General Urshizu?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So they become these Japanese feudal generals instead of these thanes of Cawdor and whatever they are in Macbeth. And there's quite an interesting. I don't remember it being like this in the play. There's an interesting thing where there's this like line of like numbered forts, aren't there, that like escalate in importance, that they kind of have dominion over, and there's kind of almost like a hierarchy of these forts, and you can kind of get promoted by being given like the next level fort up.
I mean, the kind of the hierarchy is laid out by the witches when they kind of explain Fëine Court or Fëine Glams, and then King. And so you understand the hierarchy, but it's not as easy as like the American block system of numbered streets,
like these forts are. Because it's like, oh, you're the head of the second fort, aren't you? Well, you're going to be head of the first fort, and you're going to be head of the forest fort. And it's like there's this hierarchy of forts that get passed around. Then another early difference is, instead of having these three witches, which are obviously sort of iconic from the established version, you get this one kind of androgynous spirit who I think's a male actor, but they refer to it as a woman, and it's kind of this weird voice. It's kind of like an A24 horror movie ghost instead, isn't it?
Yeah, the sort of the androgyny's kind of there from the Shakespeare as well. That's quite an explicit part of their descriptions in there as well. But yeah, that was good. I like that. I found it. I really like the opening. I like the you kind of. There's the monument, isn't there, to the castle, and then it becomes all misty and kind of this cloud of mist descends and then dissipates, and then you're kind of been thrown back in time, and you can see Spiderweb's castle as was. It's quite a nice little start. It was very kind of I don't know. It set up the atmosphere really, really well. Just set up the atmosphere really well, and kind of made the whole place seem quite remote and desolate as well, in a way that I thought was quite fit.
There's a lot of mist in this film to very great effect. So you get obviously we've mentioned Toshiro Mifune plays the Macbeth character. Minoru Chiaki, who at this point has been in, I think, every Kurosawa film since The Quiet Duel, because Minoru Chiaki, I don't know if I mentioned this on a previous podcast, he was the actor who played the Mifune role in The Quiet Duel when Kurosawa saw it on stage, and he's kind of brought him in off the stage, and he's been in every film since then. So Chiaki was the guy you really didn't like in The Idiot, who is like Setsuko Hara's would-be husband. He's the funny samurai in Seven Samurai. He's like the most bastard-like son in I Live in Fear. He's the son who's really agitating the father most. And so he's kind of increasingly important in Kurosawa's films of this period. And here he gets cast as, I think, General Mickey, who is the Banquo character, right? So he's the best friend. Yeah. There's a line in the film, and obviously I don't know how much of this is the subtitles versus maybe in the Japanese it sounds different. There's a different word for it. But there's a line where Lady Macbeth is trying to convince Mifune to kind of do dirty General Mickey, and Mifune's Macbeth says, but Mickey's my best friend, and it made me wonder if they'd had that conversation and talked about being best friends, but it just seemed very. It did seem like a kind of a juvenile way to put it for the general, but yeah, they are best friends. They've been summoned to the fort. Basically, the way it's set up at the beginning is that I wonder if this is a nod to the play and the play roots of the whole thing, because one of the things you said last time when I asked like what you're expecting is you thought, well, I think we might see some of these battles. I think we might see Kurosawa doing battles like around.
The battles aren't really part of the play. They're things that tend to be added into adaptations.
Exactly, and so, but I think you were wondering, well, is Kurosawa going to have a pitched sort of samurai battle somewhere in it? And actually, maybe because of the play and the way it's done there, you have this element here where you've got a bunch of people sitting around and they're like, "Oh, my lord, someone's
manspreading." They're like, it's almost like some taking their legs and pulled them as far apart as possible at right angles.
But you got this guy, and he's just hearing these reports, and you just have all these scouts running in, and it's sort of comical in a way because you get one after the other coming in, just running in and going, "Oh, by the way, now we're winning. Oh, by the way, now that person's retreating. Oh, by the way," it's basically what happens at the beginning. And so because he hears of this, the Mifune general character rescuing.
I mean, it's like in the days before mobile phones at football matches. Like if you wanted to know how a rival team was getting on, because their results affected yours, you used to have somebody, one person getting messages sent to them on their mobile or listening to it or trying to listen to it on a radio and then updating everybody else while you were watching the match you were actually there to see.
Yeah. No, that's true. I remember those days. So it's kind of, it's sort of like that. The word of mouth has to come by these people. And because of that, this guy, he eventually hears that Mifune's turned around this certain defeat into victory. And he sends for him and General Mickey to come. And that's where they come along and they meet the witch. After that, they come to the king, don't they? They come to the Lord, and he hands them these ceremonial swords, I guess, which say that now you're gonna be the king of Fort One or whatever it is, which is the first stage of the prophecy coming true. And you get Mifune doing a lot of his very at this point, I would say typically Mifune sort of like, I don't want to call it mugging because that's very loaded, it's like I'm really criticizing it, but like definitely these kind of horror faces that he kind of pulls in close up, and you can kind of tell at this point like what Mifune's reaction is going to be to a certain development facially.
It is mugging adjacent, it's not full on mugging, but there is you're right. He's got a few go-tos.
He does, and you can kind of tell when the prophecy is going to come true. You can kind of, before you see it, you could picture how Mifune would play that moment, and I think he does play that moment that way. There's a note here I've written. My first note on the film is Mifune's gotten into the makeup drawer again because he was quite extremely made up in I Live in Fear, and he's kind of got very extreme makeup here as well. And it's funny because they don't obviously do anything like that to General Mickey. So General Mickey looks kind of on a quote unquote normal, like he looks kind of naturalistic. And then you've got Mifune next to him who's got these like really dark like lines and this really dramatic sort of stuff going on in his face, which I think is quite funny. And then you get the Lady Macbeth character, who is played by is Isuzu Yamada, who is she's an actress who's not in very many Kurosawa films, but she's quite prominent across the films of Naruse, Mizoguchi. She's in a couple of Ozu films. She's kind of been around a lot of kind of classic movies of the period. And her interpretation of Lady Macbeth, when I was reading the Donald Richard book around this, he spends quite a lot of time talking about how much Kurosawa likes no theatre and how into no theatre adaptations of Shakespeare and no theatre stories like this in general Kurosawa was. And he kind of makes a point of talking about how in the middle of this film, which isn't made in that style, the Lady Macbeth character is played pretty much exactly like a no theatre character, like her makeup and everything, but also her movement and the way she speaks, her intonation. Apparently, it's like a no theatre character, just sort of plonked down in the middle of this, and you do sort of get that vibe. She is very stylized, isn't she? She's
very stylized, very static, very kind of steadfast, kind of. I think that's the right way to describe it. Just sort of very, very deliberate in the movement, very kind of unchanging in facial expression and intonation. Just, I don't know. You could almost interpret her as a sort of a. There's always a lot written about Lady Macbeth's part in the play, and you know who's to blame. In this, you could almost interpret her as like a manifestation of something that's going on inside his own head. You know, she doesn't seem real in quite the same way that people around her have seen, except for in the Ghost at the Feast scene where she has to address everybody else in the room because Mifune's seeing ghosts, but when it's just them and especially because they're in this room, presumably their chambers, which are so sparse, it becomes it's almost like it is very much a psychodrama at those points, I think, which is good.
Yeah, absolutely. There's an interesting thing where she's kind of shuffling around in this quite restrictive kimono, and there's this sound of this fabric kind of going shh, 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 shh on itself, and that starts to kind of herald her arrival in the next scenes, doesn't it? You'll hear her shuffling before you see her shuffling. She kind of comes into frame in this thing, and it's something that I think speaks to this idea that this version of Macbeth is more cowardly, less redeemable, less heroic than the Shakespeare Macbeth. Is that like I said at the start, it seems less like he's noble and goes astray, and more like he's just kind of a weaselly guy looking for an excuse to be a bastard. Because in this version, you don't really get, or at least I didn't get the sense that, you know, this is this woman in his ear who's like twisting his noble intentions and turning him astray. So much as just a guy who's too cowardly to act out his powerful murder revenge grab, and he just needs someone to kind of enable him.
I think that's supported by like the sidelining of Shimura's character as well, because I was expecting much more. Like I think I said last time, I'd recently watched the Justin Kurzel version, and I looked at the play as well. I didn't properly reread it. I just kind of scanned through it to try and get an idea of the pacing, and there is far more. Macduff is in it far more. There's far more scenes of sort of Macduff and Malcolm sort of talking about his Macbeth's intentions, and there is a sense of when and where the outside threat is coming from, and you know, it's a big jump in this as well to sort of Banquo's going to Lady Macbeth suggests. I'm sorry, I'm using the
it's
old
easier.
Name, yeah, suggests that Banquo is going to inform of this prophecy, and it's going to there'll be repercussions. But you don't see any of that stuff. It all stays with Toshiro Mifune. So there's no kind of the external pressures aren't validated in any way through seeing those scenes. And it, like you say, it becomes much more about his own cowardice and his own personal struggle with it, which I thought, it does allow for a really strong character study, I think, and explore that particular side of the character, and doesn't allow him any heroism or make any apologies for the decisions that he makes across the film.
No, it's interesting. It's actually interesting you brought up the thing with Shimura, because I wrote that down, because I remember at the end of the last episode when I asked what you were expecting, you were saying how you were kind of excited to see Shimura and Mifune going up against each other and to see them play off each other in a sort of an antagonistic way they haven't in any of the previous films. So I was wondering if the really reduced role of Shimura in this film, because he is barely in it, like blink and you miss Shimura in this film, really. Was that a disappointment, or did you find that the focus, like you say, on this character study sort of made that?
I mean, it's disappointing in as much as I'd like to have seen those two actors going head to head, but it's a different telling of the same story. So I found the telling of the story in this particular way interesting. Like, the Justin Kurzel version, the most recent one that I've seen, that's why it's in my head. It's Fassbender and Sean Harris, and I can watch Sean Harris in anything. Like, he's just an immensely mesmeric and like completely intimidating actor. Although this side in that film, he's kind of on the right side, so it was interesting to see him in that. So and they all those other scenes of between Macduff and Macbeth are in the film. So there's a lot of back and forth before you get to the end. So that's what I was expecting, and most of that had been exercised. I also kind of made a little note about when I was watching it. So it's 25 minutes before you get to the end of the man spreading scene at the castle, and that's only the first 3 scenes in the play. It's 8 pages in. I mean, that's nonsense, isn't it? 8 pages. They weren't published, but they weren't published in an A5 book or whatever. But yeah, it's only it's very short, like that section, and it was really kind of elongated for the beginning, which was kind of my first indication that there would be different emphasis and different in this telling of the story, basically.
I'm not going to go blow by blow through the film. Like, I think we should just kind of go through the things that we really liked and sort of highlight some of the things that kind of draw attention. Am I right in thinking, like, well, not am I right in thinking so much, this is my opinion, but I've heard other people say, for example, that the woodcutter's introduction in Rashomon drags, for example. Like, I've seen people say, the bit where Shimura is walking through the woods, and it takes quite a while, and the camera tracks long, and you get the shots of the sunlight behind him. I really like that scene. Like, it's really long. And I've heard people say that drags in that film, and I've heard people say that about some other bits in Kurosawa's where they're kind of. We've said that about a few. Like I think it was in One Wonderful Sunday. There's the scene where the woman is weeping in her house as the rain's dripping in, and it kind of goes on for maybe 10 minutes longer than it really needs to, So
the scene in or the going through the streets and stray dog scene that kind of perhaps goes on a little bit too long, even though I really like it.
Exactly. And so there are these scenes in Kurosawa films that, depending on who you ask, they find kind of stretched out beyond all reason. For whatever reason in this film, this is the one where that does affect me, because normally in those other examples I'm not as bothered. I've got several scenes in here which I've just written long next to, and I like this film, by the way. Like, it isn't one of my favorite Kurosawa films, but I do appreciate it. But like the scene where they're coming out of the mist after seeing the witch, that goes on for an interminable amount of time. They're just running backwards and forwards on horses, like going through mist for ages. There's a scene where they're carrying a coffin along, which goes on for a while. There's a horse chase scene as well, which goes on for a while. So there's all these bits in it that for me did feel really stretched out.
Against any of that.
Yeah, no, that's why I bring it up, because I'm wondering, like, obviously mileage will vary on these things. I'm wondering how you found them, but you found this film well paced and all of that?
I like the first 20 minutes or so. I thought it was. I just thought it set up atmosphere really, really well.
Yeah. Because I did. For me, some of the scenes in this stretch out, and I was at a point where, because obviously we like log everything we watch on Letterboxd, and we review things on Letterboxd. And for what it's worth, we give things a star rating, even though I know how arbitrary that is, but it's kind of, fun exercise. And I was thinking, like, through spells this film, like, I'm going to give this 3 stars. Like, I appreciate it, but I don't really love it. Like, it isn't one of my favorites. It isn't one I'm going to go to and rewatch like have some of the others. And in the end, I gave it the same 4 stars you did. And I think that what I'm building up to with this is, and as this sounds like a pretentious ass phrase, I know that, but it's the power of the imagery in this film that really makes it stand out. Because the thing is it really is a film that's almost entirely, in my opinion, there is obviously this psychodrama, there is this character study, but the strength of this film is that there are some really memorable, stark, kind of visceral images to it. Like, I've seen this film, I think this is the 3rd or 4th time I've seen it, and the main things that stay in my memory from it whenever I think of Throne of Blood are not just the famous bit near the end with all the arrows, which we'll get to talking about a bit more later, where he kind of gets, becomes a pincushion full of arrows and all flying all around him, but also the way Kurosawa shoots the trees advancing on the castle. You get these shots and they move in kind of slow motion, and there's this kind of ominous music.
You can't really tell the scale of them. Are they shrubs? Are they like full size?
But exactly, and they're eerie, and there's mist coming out from them, and that's a really powerful image. There's also like other ones.
It could almost just be a strong wind as well, couldn't it? But it doesn't. They're not quite moving they're not quite synchronous, and they're moving as well. Some of them moving forward, some of them moving backwards. It's a really, really strong image.
It's really strong image, and then another one is like that blood-stained wall in that room they stay in is really amazing as well. Like, there's this kind of wood paneled wall that they kind of they go and stay in the guest room in their castle, and apparently the previous occupant of the castle had killed himself, or the rebel leader that they overpowered killed themselves, and there's this big streak of blood up the wall, which has a kind of thematic resonance, obviously, because they're in there plotting with this kind of fallen rebels' blood on the wall. But that's a really great image as well, this kind of street, because as you say, one of the things that stood out to me watching this film is how sparse and unadorned all the rooms in this castle are. They're very empty rooms, and so when you're in this one where suddenly there's this like dark patch, because obviously it's in black and white, so you get this just like dark splatter pattern against the back wall. It's kind of grim, it's a lot of the imagery of that stuff really I found really powerful, and I think that's really what elevates this film. There's a bit in the Ritchie book actually which I wrote down because I thought it was really good, where he says there's never been a blacker and a whiter film in black and white, and that's sort of how I see this, because this is obviously all black and white films are like monochromatic, but to me this film is so monochromatic, for a better word. It's like, so it exists in such like stark, like dark black and like white to me. But anyway, I wondered to you, like, how much of this film is kind of the imagery as well.
I don't know. I mean, I was just caught up in the retelling. Like, there are some scenes where some of the scenes with Lady Macbeth in that room do have that let's call it the Kurosawa drift, when they kind of they just kind of carry on a little bit. But I was in for this one. Like, it didn't seem to drag to me at all. But I do know what you're saying about every so often there's just some image or another that just really jumps out the screen. I love the scene at the end where he's towards the end where he's rallying the troops and explaining to them why he can't be defeated, and there's a great shot of him of the balcony with just this huge throng of people looking up at him, and he's kind of trying to play the crowd a little bit and walk up and down the catwalk and shout at them. It's just really beautifully staged and shot. There's also something, and this is watching it in 2021. I'm not watching. There's something about seeing the kind of the big sort of epic sweeps of all the people on horses with all the flags and all the production design, where you're thinking they shot this. This is really, it's got an added layer to it in this day and age of knowing that this is all done practically with money and with people, and it's really kind of, the scale of it's really impressive, I think.
Yeah, they got if I'm correct from how what I interpreted from what was written about it, the that castle that they're in, the sort of Spiderweb's castle thing at the a lot of that ending sequence takes place in. They built that, and it was built by the local US Marine Corps. A lot of it. they kind of got the Marines in to kind of help dig it up and like do all of the like earthworks and like build this thing. And apparently they made some very static. Toho built some open sets for this film that were just very traditional stagey open sets, and Kurosawa started filming on them. Was just like, no, we need to build the whole fucking castle. And Richie writes in his book that Toho had learned from Seven Samurai that they just had to give in because Kurosawa was going to get his way at some point, so they just let him build the castle. But it's
a nice because it is, a lot of it is so internal and small, and so much of it is between Washizu and his wife. That when it opens up in these moments to sort of show the bigger picture, but it isn't the epic. It isn't that kind of. It has epic moments without being. It has epic moments and kind of reminds you that things are happening on a slightly epic scale without overindulging that, if you know what I mean. Does that make sense?
It does, and it does remind me of the play, because that was always the slightly frustrating thing about the play when you're a 14-year-old reading it, is that they talk about these battles, they talk about all these things going on, but it follows Macbeth and it follows his moral dilemma, which is something that I think now, as a 35-year-old man, I would probably think was good. But reading it in my early teens at school, you're sort of like, but this battle's going on over there, and Shakespeare's just got this dude talking about it. And I think the film retains that aspect of the play quite a lot, because like you say, it does allow for this sweep that there is this epic stuff going on, but it never loses focus on it being about the character study or being about this guy. And I think that is a testament to it. I think that's one of the really great things about it. And I think that I've written a bit here as well in my notes about Mifune showing kind of maturation as an actor here as well, I think, because while I did talk about him kind of his near mugging, and you can kind of see those visceral reactions he's going to do, his portrayal here is a lot more restrained, because Macbeth goes mad, right? Like he goes mad, sees a ghost and he starts running around being crazy. And there are bits where he just acts completely out of madness. And there's bits at the end where he's realizes the forest is moving in and stuff, and he's doing his crazy laughing and all that kind of stuff that comes in when Mifune goes nuts. But if you compare this to some of the crazy he's done in other films, even in Seven Samurai, it's a lot more restrained, which is interesting because you'd think Macbeth is licensed to kind of really dial it up to 11 in this instance, but he really doesn't. Like there's a bit of restraint here that you don't get in his really hammy performance in The Idiot, or his really crazy performance in Rashomon, like you say. Some of those earlier ones, even in Drunken Angel, like he mugs a lot more because that's his first Kurosawa film. Like he's much more unhinged. In this, he kind of keeps it pared back a bit, and it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I thought it was he gave good Macbeth.
Yeah, absolutely. There's an interesting thing that Kurosawa said about this film in terms of production, where he talked about how the kind of inclination of most Japanese filmmakers, according to Kurosawa, would be to go in close on things, going close on emotions, and how he kept having to try and explain to his crew that he didn't want that, and how they always wanted to push in on things, and he was always asking them to pull out. And he writes about he talked about how he wanted to move backwards in moments of emotion rather than moving in. And that's an interesting thing when you hear him say that, or at least when I kind of read that he said that, it makes you realize that's exactly what happens all the way through the film, because there are so many moments where, for example, when he gets angry and he's going mad and he kills that guy who's failed to kill Mickey's son, for example, he kind of sinks back into the room, right? Like it's all staged in a certain way where this guy's in the foreground. Mifune comes in and stabs him, but then he kind of staggers backwards and goes towards the back of the room and goes back towards his chair. You know, there's things kind of end up falling back further deeper into the frame as the more emotional they get, rather than pushing in. I don't have anything intellectual to say about that.
I mean, well, is that to do with the empathetic reaction the audience is supposed to have as we kind of deviate from his reaction and his subsequent actions? Like, this is how he's going to respond to it. We're moving away from like being able to empathize or sort of agree with his actions. Do you think maybe?
Yeah, maybe he's trying to be sort of objective in the way we're watching this guy, rather than make you invest too much in loving him or anything like that. That's possibly why. But it does make the film very stark, and it does make the characters' unhingedness more, I don't know, visceral and frightening at times as well. I think that you almost watch them as a third party in the room, watching him freak out, rather than being kind of in his head or with him, I think. Possibly. Who knows?
Should we talk about the ending?
Yeah, sure. Let's do it.
Yeah, well, you were very kind of hyped up by this. This is the classic bullhead ending for you, by the sounds of things. The wow, I'm in the end and you got a hit kind of thing.
Yeah. It did help solidify it for me as like me going, yeah, this is a great film. The final, it's not just the bit with the arrows, which we'll talk more about. It's like the most iconic bit. That's where the trees move as well, which is, as I said, a really powerful image. All of that staging, like you said, with all the troops and everything. I think the final shots of the film are beautiful as well. You see the castle, and then the mist just comes in and overtakes it, and all of that. Like the final 20 minutes of this film is so good that it kind of does leave me anyway just really impressed. But yeah, talk about the ending. Tell the good listener what this arrow thing is we've mentioned like 10 times.
Yeah, so I'd seen those images, and I think if I'm looking at the BFI player here, I'm pretty sure it's their splash image. When you search the film up, is Mifune looking at some of the arrows that have just narrowly missed his face. So he's there. He's waiting. The trees are moving in. He's told everyone that he can't be defeated until the trees move, and then they move. So everyone runs away and leaves him, and he's left on the ramparts, and all the archers are moving in. And they start firing on him, and they don't really stop, do they? And these arrows he's standing up on the ramparts with hundreds of archers beneath him, and these arrows just sort of streaming in. Some of them are hitting him, sticking in his armor. Some of them are hitting like to the side. He's moving backwards and forwards, and every time he moves, more arrows are sort of coming at him at all angles, just kind of completely littering the walls, and he's getting more and more stuck by these things, and kind of they really toy with him, don't they? They really kind of drag it out, and kind of it's not like a quick arrow to the heart and down he goes. It's like he's trying to get away, and like they're not coming in at any sort of consistent speed, so they'll stop for a couple of seconds and then come back in, and then there's these great close shots where they just come in and they're like this far away from his head, and then it will cut to a longer shot and you'll see them coming in from like 3 or 4 meters, and you're watching it thinking, fucking hell, they shot arrows at him, didn't they? Like that's the only way that's the only way I think this could be done. I don't know how else they did it. How did they do it?
Well, this is interesting. When I was in Japan a couple of years ago, I went and visited a film studio lot, did like a tour. And one of the things they do is they show you the filming. They have like live actors and everything come in, and they reenacted this scene of this ninja fighting a bunch of people on a set. And they show you it you can see the cameras, like the screens where you can view what the cameras see. And you can also see on set what's going on. You're sitting in a room behind glass watching it all play out. They actually
long lenses and things like that.
Well, they've sorry,
was it long lenses, using long lenses so that
for perspective on the arrows or something?
Yeah.
No. What they do is, and this might be disappointing when you know, but they showed it happening. Is the Japanese method, seemingly, because I don't know of anyone else doing this, for firing arrows at people very close to them in films, is basically that there's a string that the arrow travels down, and it goes to a certain point. And actually knowing that now, I was saying to Jen, my wife, watching Throne of Blood last night, knowing that now you can see the strings on the arrows.
Right.
And there were several bits in it. I was going, oh, look, it's those strings. And you can see them in the background very clearly around the arrows. So a lot of those arrows, I don't know all of them, but a lot of those arrows are traveling on these strings where they just they travel up the string to where they're supposed to go. I don't know how that works or what force moves them up the string, but that's what happens anyway. And they move up the string and they go where they're supposed to go. The thing that makes me wonder if that's what's going on with all of them, because it's definitely going on with some of them. The thing that makes me wonder if that's going on with all of them is you do get impact and you do get like the wood splintering, don't you, around the impact of it. So I'm not sure if it was a mix of firing actual arrows and having these ones on strings, but it's some of them do look real. Some of them have impact, and also Kurosawa being so fastidious about detail and so fastidious about wanting things to seem realistic and not doing things just the traditional way. I can imagine some of them were real, but I don't know that for sure.
I mean, the only slight disappointment for me in the scene is the one that eventually goes through his neck. You can see the plate that goes around his neck, like which is fair, but it's quite good. It's obviously they've done the thing where they've stopped the camera or got him to pause, basically, chuck the thing around him, and then just edited the two things together, and it's very quick but
it's jarring. It's jarring, like I always think of this with Ray Harryhausen monsters, is that like they're not realistic looking. Like you can see that in Jason and the Argonauts, the skeletons are model skeletons, but there's something very uncanny and gross and disturbing about their movements. There's something very tangible and horrible about Ray Harryhausen skeletons, and it was kind of the same with that like jump cut in this with the arrow. It's very clearly fake, but it's very jarring. Like it's a really jarring cut that makes the arrow somehow more disturbing. And it's certainly because of that extra, like, even though it's probably a split second, our mind is used to receiving these images. And so it stands out. Like the fact that there's an extra sort of pause on that moment kind of gives it extra prominence. You know what I mean? Like there's a real moment where time seems to stand still and an arrow goes through his neck.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the whole scene, apart from the fact that there's arrows flying everywhere, it's just sold by Mifune's like abject terror in the whole thing. He just, like he's allowed to. I think he's allowed to mug during this thing, this performance, and it does seem it's so well done. It does make me wonder, like, how much trust he had in the special effects team.
Yeah.
Especially because he must have been wearing padding or something, or for some of those arrows to sort of, because he gets, like you say, he gets pinkish, and he's wearing his armor, and I imagine there's ways and means of doing all of that as well. But it's just so, and it's quite an elongated scene as well. It goes on for a while. It's not a quick scene, and I think it works better for this. Like you say, for this kind of cowardly interpretation of the character, it works a lot better than going sort of one-to-one with Macduff and dying on the battlefield. It's like it's like an extermination scene almost, isn't it? Rather than anything else. It's incredible ending scene.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It really is. Something I really wanted to ask about that I've been dying to ask you since the start, but I want to sort of get through, talk about the actual film first, is that I understand, like, because we talked about it before, that you are a fan of this particular play and that you've seen a lot of adaptations. You've seen it on the stage in several different permutations. You've also seen a lot of films of Macbeth over the years. So I really wanted to find out, like, where this stacks for you as an interpretation, where you kind of place it in that own weird, like, canon of Macbeth adaptation.
I don't know. I mean, it's difficult to say. In filmic terms, I've in terms of going to see the plays, it's a very, very different experience, isn't it? It's difficult thing to compare. But in terms of films, I've not seen too many film adaptations, actually, thinking about it. I saw the Polanski one at school. I saw I saw one with I think it was James McAvoy. set in a restaurant in 2004, and I saw the Justin Kurzel one recently. I don't know. I found this. I feel like I would rewatch this before I'd watch any of those. To be honest, I feel like this is much more of a. I found this really entertaining. Just really, really solid storytelling, basically. Yeah, I think this would be the one. It's difficult to say what my favorite would be, but this would be the one that I'd be most likely to rewatch. I don't know if that's because it's new or whatever, but.
So, in terms of Kurosawa's own work, where would you put this from what you've seen so far up to now?
This is just this just edges. It's just below Rashomon in terms of appreciation, but probably equal to it in enjoyment.
Okay, so is that there? No, edges it. It's there, isn't it?
No,
yeah,
just
appreciation.
Just behind it on appreciation.
Oh, okay, but edges it in terms of enjoyment. So here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'll format that later. Okay, cool. I need to sort this table out. I say that every single episode, but I've just not got around to addressing it. But we need a different scale because it's getting congested up there in the top right corner. So yeah, on high and low.
We need a Z-axis as well. I don't know what would be on the Z-axis, but it needs to be a three-dimensional scale.
Three-dimensional space, indeed. So do you have anything else you want to sort of say about the film? Any other stray observations or closing statements on it?
I don't think so. It's interesting. It was interesting. You know, we've kind of noticed before whenever we've seen some sort of improvement or advancement in the work that there seems to be a step backwards. Like especially with
Seven Samurai: Twilight of Fear.
Yeah. This seemed to balance it. Like it still had the scale and the ambition and the ideas, but was able to do the small story within it. And it didn't seem. I don't know. It didn't seem. It didn't. It's a great story. It didn't seem as kind of. Although it is, like we say, I've said the word far too many times, although it does come across as a bit of a psychodrama, it doesn't seem as complex as something as Ikiru, but still very well done. And in terms of it being sort of having its epic moments, it's obviously not. It's not Seven Samurai. So it was. It feels like he's at this point. He seems to be settling into like. I don't know. We'll see how the rest of the films goes. But if this is like from here on in, he is Mr. Dependable, then I wouldn't be surprised. Do you know what I mean?
Okay, yeah, I know what you mean. I don't want to preface anything too much, but I would just say about the Lower Depths that it's one that I very barely remember, and then after that you've got Hidden Fortress. So I feel like this pattern.
We're not through it yet.
Yeah. There's often this thing that'll happen on film Reddit in particular, where somebody will post something along the lines of which director had the best run in given decade. And I saw it come up once. Someone said, which director had the best run in the 50s? And I wanted to say Kurosawa because in my mind I was like, Ikiru, Seven Samurai, like all these things kind of running into each other. And then whenever I looked at his filmography for that, I was like, no, it's not duds necessarily, but it's not classic. It's like classic, interesting film, classic. You know, there's this kind of mix. I'm interested to see the Lower Depths again because it's one like I said, I don't really remember. I've seen it twice before, but I never sticks in my mind. It's based on Maxim Gorky's most famous play, so it's him going into Russian literature territory again, which obviously we last visited with The Idiot. And my memory of it is that it's just a bunch of dirty-looking people in one house, and it doesn't really go anywhere else. But it's 2 hours long. That's my memory of it. I don't think it's necessarily one that's held in low regard. I seem to see its name come up listed among the kind of classics sometimes. So I might have not hit it at the best time. But based on that, what's your sort of expectations of the Lower Depths?
I'm completely, almost entirely ignorant of Russian literature and theatre, so I don't know what to expect from Maxim Gorky. Previously filmed by Jean Renoir. Okay. In which the inhabitants of a slum while away their time longing for escape or dreaming for a better life. The Lower Depths, a brilliant exploration, no less than Rashomon, of the conflict between the comfort and illusion and bitter reality. It sounds like poverty porn to me. It sounds like
a 90s British kitchen sink drama with Kathy Burke about how grim life is.
Yes and no. I mean, yes and no. I mean, the thing about a lot of sort of British working class films is they tend, like what's his name, Mike Leigh.
Yeah,
there's humor, there's humanity in it, there's life, and there may be, and same thing in Ken Loach. There may be sort of deprivation and problems, but people enjoy their lives as much as they can with what they've got. Whereas this seems like a bit more of a chin-strokey intelligentsia. I'm so glad that, you know, how do people live without their second home in Cornwall? I think I'm gonna hate it. I'm gonna hate it.
I hope you hate it. I hope you hate it because our graph could really use one. Hopefully, you either really enjoy it but don't appreciate it, or you really appreciate it but you don't enjoy it at all, because we've got a lot of white space that needs filling. I would say we could two for it with something, but Hidden Fortress probably requires its own episode. So let's perhaps we'll join here next week or the week after. Within the next 2 weeks, we'll join here for possibly a shorter episode for the Lower Depths, depending on how much we end up having to say about it. What was the other one we didn't really have too much to say about? We did a kind of shorter episode on recently, a few episodes ago. But we'll, I imagine it'll be one of those. And
I Live in Fear.
We'll come in. Was it I Live in Fear? Okay. But yeah, it might be a case. It might be a case of that. But we'll see. We might be surprised. We might love it. But we'll see. We'll see how that goes. But in the meantime, I've been Rob Beams, and this has been Craig Ennis. And thank you very much for listening. And we'll see you next time later on down the trail. Thank you. Bye.